The rain hadn't stopped since the moment the first shovel of earth hit Robert's casket, a relentless gray drizzle that seemed to want to wash the entire world clean of color. Standing there at the edge of the reception hall, watching the last of the mourners retreat to their cars under a sea of black umbrellas, I felt a hollowing silence expand within my chest. It had only been 3 days since Robert took his last breath, his hand frail and cold in mine, and the world felt fundamentally wrong without him in it. The house was filled with the cloying scent of lilies and the murmurs of people who didn't know what to say. But now, as the room emptied, the air grew heavy with a different kind of tension. I turned from the window to see them standing there, Mike and Chloe, Robert's children, my stepchildren. They hadn't shed a tear at the graveside service. Instead, they had stood shoulder to shoulder, checking their watches and whispering to one another with an urgency that felt entirely misplaced for a funeral. Now, with the guests gone, the pretense of mourning had evaporated completely, replaced by a cold, predatory focus that made my stomach turn. Mike was the first to approach, loosening his black tie, as if the mere act of wearing it for 2 hours had been an agonizing burden. He didn't ask how I was coping. He didn't offer a hug or even a generic word of comfort. He simply walked up to the coffee table where I was gathering Robert's framed photos and leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "We need to talk, Sarah," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "We didn't want to make a scene in front of the pastor, but we can't drag this out." Chloe stood right behind him, tapping her long, manicured fingernails against the screen of her phone, her eyes darting between me and her brother. I looked at them, truly looked at them, trying to find some trace of the man I had loved for 15 years in their faces. But I found nothing. Robert had been kind, generous to a fault, and patient. These two were sharp angles and restless greed. "Can't this wait?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts to remain composed. "Your father was buried 2 hours ago. I haven't even had a moment to sit down." "Time is money, Sarah. You know how it works," Chloe cut in, finally looking up from her screen. She walked over to the buffet table, picked up a leftover canapé, inspected it with disdain, and tossed it back. "Look, we're not here to play happy family. We've been talking, and we need to settle the estate issues immediately. Specifically, the cabin." My heart skipped a beat. The cabin at Lake Tahoe. It wasn't just a house. It was the sanctuary where Robert and I had spent our happiest years, where we had retreated when his diagnosis first came in, where we sat on the deck watching the sunset reflect off the water, pretending that time wasn't running out. "The vacation home," I repeated, clutching a photo frame to my chest. "What about it?" Mike stepped closer, invading my personal space just enough to be intimidating. "We're selling it," he stated flatly. "The market is hot right now, and Chloe and I have opportunities we can't miss. We need the liquidity." I stared at him, unable to comprehend the callousness. "You want to sell the cabin now?" "Mike, that place meant everything to your father. His ashes aren't even cold, and you're talking about real estate listings?" Mike rolled his eyes, a gesture so reminiscent of his teenage years that it almost made me want to laugh, if the situation weren't so grim. "Don't get sentimental on us, Sarah. Dad is gone. He doesn't care about the view of the lake anymore. But we do care about our future." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through a graph that looked like a jagged mountain range. "Crypto is bottoming out right now. It's the perfect time to buy in before the next bull run. I have a lead on a new coin that's going to strictly 100 times, but I need capital. And Chloe," he gestured to his sister, "she's been eyeing that new G-Wagon for months. We're not going to let a pile of wood in the mountains sit there collecting dust when it could be turning into actual wealth." The vulgarity of it was suffocating. They weren't talking about survival or paying off debts. They were talking about gambling on internet coins and buying luxury cars while their father's grave was still fresh. "I'm not agreeing to that," I said, finding a sudden steel in my spine. "I'm living there. That is my home now. I'm going back there to sort through his things, to grieve in peace. You can't just sell it out from under me." Chloe laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed in the empty hall. "Oh, Sarah, you really don't get it, do you?" She stepped forward, her face hardening. "We're not asking for your permission. We're telling you what's going to happen." We checked the public records last week. The deed to the Lake Tahoe house is in Robert Miller's name. Just his name. Not yours. She let the words hang in the air like a guillotine blade. You know what that means, right? Mike added, a smug grin spreading across his face. It means you have no legal claim to it. You're the stepmom, the second wife. Without your name on that deed, the property flows to the next of kin. Us, his biological children. I felt the blood drain from my face. I knew Robert had handled the finances and I had never questioned him, never demanded to see the paperwork, because I trusted him with my life. Had he really forgotten? Had he really left me this vulnerable? So here's the deal, Mike continued, checking his watch again as if he had a dinner reservation to catch. We are generous people. We'll give you a few weeks to get your stuff out. But the real estate agent is coming to take photos right after Thanksgiving. You need to be gone by then. Completely gone. Keys on the counter. You can't do this, I whispered, the shock giving way to a rising tide of indignation. I cared for him for 5 years while you two were busy partying in Miami and ignoring his calls. That house is full of my things, my life. Mike shrugged, buttoning his suit jacket, signaling the conversation was over. That's life, Sarah. Should have secured the bag when you had the chance. You have until Thanksgiving. Don't make us call the sheriff to evict you. It would look bad for everyone. He turned on his heel and walked towards the door, Chloe following close behind. Before she left, she turned back one last time, her expression utterly devoid of sympathy. Don't take anything that isn't yours, Sarah. We have an inventory list. Just the clothes on your back and whatever knickknacks you brought into the marriage. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, leaving me alone in the silent, flower-scented room, clutching the photograph of Robert, the sound of the rain against the window, the only witness to their cruelty. I stood there for a long time, the silence they left behind pressing against my eardrums, louder than their shouting had been. Eventually, the catering staff began to fold up the chairs, their eyes averting mine, silent witnesses to my humiliation. I couldn't stay there, but the thought of returning to our main house in the suburbs, empty, cold, and echoing with Robert's absence, was unbearable. And Mike's ultimatum was ringing in my head like a death knell. Thanksgiving. That was less than 3 weeks away. Panic began to rise in my throat, but it was quickly replaced by a desperate need to be close to him. If they were going to take the cabin from me, if they were really going to sell the place where we had planned to grow old, I wasn't going to spend my last allotted days sitting in the city, waiting for the axe to fall. I needed to be there. I needed to say goodbye to the house on my own terms, not theirs. I dried my eyes, walked out into the unrelenting drizzle, and made a decision that felt more like a retreat than a stand. I didn't go home to pack properly. I just got in the car and turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life as the only steady thing in my crumbling world. The drive up to Lake Tahoe was usually a journey of decompression, a gradual shedding of the city's concrete skin for the pine-scented embrace of the mountains. Robert and I had made this drive hundreds of times, singing along to classic rock radio, holding hands over the center console, anticipating the first glimpse of that sapphire blue water. But this time, the silence in the car was deafening. The passenger seat was empty, a void that felt heavier than any passenger could be. The winding road, slick with the remnants of an early November snow, demanded my attention, but my mind kept drifting back to the scene in the reception hall, the cold calculation in Mike's eyes, the dismissive wave of Chloe's hand. They looked at our sanctuary, the place where Robert had found peace during his agonizing chemotherapy battles, and saw nothing but dollar signs and a quick flip for a volatile crypto market. I pulled into the gravel driveway as the sun began to dip behind the Sierra Nevada peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow. The cabin stood there, sturdy and welcoming, its cedar siding weathering to a silver gray that matched the mood of the season. I unlocked the door, half expecting Robert to call out from the kitchen asking if I wanted tea, but was greeted only by the stale, chilled air of a house that had been holding its breath. For the first few days, I did exactly what they expected of me. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching the spine of Robert's favorite books, folding the throw blankets he used to wrap around my shoulders on chilly evenings. I brought out the cardboard boxes, taping them shut with a rhythmic zip screech that echoed through the empty hallway. But while my hands were busy packing away the physical remnants of a life shared, my phone became an instrument of torture. Mike and Chloe didn't just want me out. They wanted to erase me, and they wanted to ensure I was too beaten down to fight back. The harassment started small. A text here, a voicemail there. But it quickly escalated into a barrage of digital psychological warfare. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while I was wrapping Robert's collection of vintage fishing lures. It was Mike. I let it go to voicemail, but the notification popped up instantly. Hey Sarah, just a reminder, the staging crew is booked for Friday morning. If your junk isn't out, they're instructed to dumpster it. Don't make this ugly. I stared at the screen, my grip tightening on a wooden lure until the hooks dug into my palm. He called it junk. 15 years of memories, of birthdays, of quiet anniversaries. All junk to be shoveled into a dumpster to make room for generic staging furniture. A few hours later, Chloe chimed in. Her approach was different, dripping with fake concern that masked a venomous intent. Sarah, she texted, I heard from Aunt Linda that you're really struggling. Maybe it's best you leave early. We don't want you having a breakdown up there all alone. It's embarrassing for the family. Just leave the keys under the mat. It wasn't just the texts. By the second week, the rumors began to circle back to me like vultures. I went into the local grocery store in Tahoe City to pick up some supplies. Coffee, bread, the basics. And ran into Mrs. Gable, a longtime neighbor and friend of Robert's. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion that I couldn't quite place until she spoke. Sarah dear, she said, leaning over her shopping cart, her voice lowered to a conspiratorial whisper. I was so sorry to hear about Robert. And, well, I heard about the trouble. I frowned, confused. Trouble. Mrs. Gable shifted uncomfortably. Well, Mike called my husband yesterday looking for the spare key code, said he needed to get in because you were. Well, he said you were stripping the copper wiring and selling Robert's antique watch collection. He said you were unstable. The blood rushed to my ears, hot and fierce. He said, what? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Gable looked terrified. I told him that didn't sound like you, Sarah, but he was so insistent. He said you were trying to liquidate everything before the probate court could stop you. I stood there in the middle of the cereal aisle, realizing the depth of their depravity. They weren't just greedy. They were actively trying to destroy my reputation to preemptively discredit me in case I tried to fight for the house. They wanted the narrative to be the crazy stepmother versus the concerned children. I took a deep breath, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. Mike is grieving in his own way, Mrs. Gable. Everything is fine. The house is safe. I walked away before I could scream, leaving my cart behind. That night, back at the cabin, I sat by the cold fireplace, the unlit logs mocking me. My instinct was to call them, to scream, to defend my honor, to tell them exactly what kind of man their father was and how ashamed he would be. But I stopped myself. I remembered the look on Lawyer Jenkins' face at the funeral, a look of calm, knowing patience. Don't engage, I told myself. Let them think they're winning. If I fought back now, if I argued, they might get suspicious. They might dig deeper. But if I remained silent, if I played the role of the defeated mourning widow packing her boxes, their arrogance would blind them. And arrogance was the only weakness Mike and Chloe had in abundance. So I didn't reply to the texts. I didn't refute the rumors publicly. I let the calls go to voicemail. I became the black hole they yelled into, giving them nothing back but silence. And it worked. Emboldened by my lack of resistance, their plans grew louder and more reckless. I found out about their Thanksgiving plans not through a direct conversation, but because Chloe was careless enough to post a public invite on her Instagram story, which I viewed from an anonymous account I used to monitor Robert's business interests. The background was a photo of our cabin, my cabin, with bold, tackily fonted text overlaid. Crypto and Turkey Takeover, Lake Tahoe edition. Housewarming party at the new estate. Champagne, views, and vibes. DM for gate code. She had tagged Mike and a dozen other influencers and entrepreneurs. They weren't just coming to inspect the property. They were coming to colonize it. They were inviting a horde of strangers to party on Robert's grave, treating his sanctuary like a frat house to celebrate a windfall they hadn't even secured yet. The date was set, Thanksgiving Day. The audacity of it took my breath away. Thanksgiving had been Robert's favorite holiday, a time for quiet reflection and gratitude, not vibes and crypto shilling. Seeing that post was the final catalyst. I picked up the phone, but not to call Mike. I dialed the number for Jenkins and Associates. "Mr. Jenkins," I said when the old lawyer picked up on the second ring. His voice was gravelly and warm, a stark contrast to the metallic sharpness of my stepchildren. "Sarah, I was expecting to hear from you. How are things up at the lake?" "They're coming, Jenkins," I said, looking out the window at the moonlit water. "Thursday, Thanksgiving Day. They're bringing a crowd. They think I'll be gone by morning." "And will you be?" Jenkins asked, though I could hear the smile in his voice. "I'll be here," I replied. "But I need everything ready. The paperwork, the sheriff, everything we discussed. I don't want any ambiguity." "We have the binder ready, Sarah," Jenkins assured me. "The living trust is ironclad." Robert was very specific. He knew this day might come, though I think he hoped he was wrong about them. "We can meet tomorrow morning at the diner in Truckee to go over the final execution. I'll bring the sheriff. He was a good friend of Robert's. He knows the situation." "Thank you," I whispered, relief washing over me like a warm wave. "They think I'm weak, Jenkins. They think I'm just the stepmom with no name on the deed." "Let them think that," Jenkins advised. "The element of surprise is your best asset right now. Let them break the lock. Let them walk in. Let them commit the act. Legally, it strengthens our position for the restraining order later." It sounds harsh, Sarah, but you have to let the trap snap shut. I hung up the phone and finally, for the first time in weeks, I lit the fire. The flames caught the birch bark and roared to life, casting dancing shadows against the stone hearth. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Robert's leather armchair. The house felt different now. It wasn't a tomb anymore. It was a fortress. I looked around at the boxes I had packed. Not to move out, I realized now, but to clear the stage for the performance that was about to unfold. I wasn't packing to leave. I was organizing. The next few days passed in a blur of surreal calm. I drove to Truckee to meet Jenkins. He was a man of few words, sliding a thick leather binder across the diner table towards me. "The Robert Miller Living Trust," it read in gold foil. "Remember," Jenkins said, tapping the cover with a weathered finger, "the deed they saw online is the original deed from 1990. They didn't check the transfer of title to the trust because it's a private document filed differently in this county. They did a lazy search, saw what they wanted to see, and stopped looking. That's their mistake." He opened the binder to the page that mattered most. "Sole trustee, Sarah Miller. Beneficiary of life estate, Sarah Miller. You hold all the cards, Sarah. You have the right to determine who enters and who leaves. Until you die, this house is effectively yours to command." I traced my name on the paper. Robert had done this 3 years ago, without telling me, knowing that he might leave me alone with wolves. Tears pricked my eyes, not from sadness this time, but from a profound sense of being loved and protected from beyond the grave. "Okay," I said, closing the binder with a definitive snap. "I'm ready." Wednesday night, the eve of Thanksgiving, the snow began to fall again, heavy and thick. I sat in the dark living room, watching the headlights of cars passing on the distant highway, wondering which one might be Mike's Range Rover or Chloe's convertible. My phone buzzed one last time. It was a text from Mike. "Clock is ticking, Sarah. Don't make me throw your stuff in the snow. 8 a.m. tomorrow. Be gone." I didn't reply. I simply turned off the phone and placed it on the mantelpiece next to Robert's urn. I checked the security camera feed on my tablet. The driveway was clear, covered in a pristine white blanket. Inside, the house was warm, silent, and waiting. I imagined them driving up tomorrow, high on arrogance and cheap champagne, thinking they were about to claim their inheritance. They had no idea that they were driving straight into a legal brick wall. I went to bed early, sleeping soundly for the first time since Robert died, knowing that tomorrow, Thanksgiving, would be served with a very cold side of justice. The dawn of Thanksgiving arrived with a deceptive serenity. the sky a bruised purple that slowly lightened into a piercing steel gray over the lake. I wasn't inside the cabin when the sun crested the mountains. Instead, I was sitting in the back of Sheriff Miller's patrol SUV, parked discreetly down the winding access road, obscured by a dense thicket of pine trees. Beside me sat Lawyer Jenkins, clutching his leather briefcase like a shield, his breath fogging up the cold window. We sat in silence, a stakeout team waiting for the criminals to arrive at the scene of the crime. I held a thermos of coffee, my hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline of impending confrontation. It didn't take long. Around 9 a.m., the silence of the forest was shattered by the aggressive roar of engines. Through the trees, I watched a cavalcade of 3 vehicles tear up the road. Mike's black Range Rover leading the pack, followed by Chloe's white convertible with the top up, and a third SUV packed with people I didn't recognize. They were honking their horns rhythmically, a cacophony of entitlement that echoed off the frozen water. "Here we go," Sheriff Miller grunted from the driver's seat, adjusting his rearview mirror. "Just give them a minute, Sarah. Let them dig the hole deep." We watched from a distance as the cars skidded to a halt in the gravel driveway of the cabin. Doors flew open and a crowd of about 10 people spilled out. They were dressed for a fashion shoot, not a mountain winter. Designer coats, impractical boots, and sunglasses, despite the overcast sky. I could see Mike marching up to the front door, his posture rigid with authority. He punched the code into the electronic keypad, the code I had changed 3 days ago. I saw him pause, frown, and punch it in again, harder this time. When the light blinked red, he kicked the base of the door in a fit of temper. Chloe was right behind him, shivering and gesturing wildly. I couldn't hear their words from this distance, but their body language was unmistakable. Confusion, followed rapidly by rage. Mike turned to the group, shouted something that made the friends laugh nervously, and then walked back to his car. He returned with a large red bolt cutter, something he must have bought specifically for this, anticipating resistance. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched him snap the padlock on the side gate and then use a pry bar from the garage to force the main entry. There was a sickening crack of splintering wood that I felt more than heard. They were in. "That's breaking and entering," Jenkins murmured, noting the time on his watch. "And destruction of property. Keep watching." It didn't take long for the violation to escalate. Within minutes, the heavy bass of electronic dance music began to thump from the house, vibrating the very air around us. They had turned my sanctuary into a nightclub before they had even taken off their coats. Through the large bay windows facing the lake, I could see silhouettes dancing, bottles being raised. And then the ultimate disrespect began. The front door swung open and Chloe emerged, holding an armful of fabric. I gasped as I recognized my favorite knit sweaters, the ones I wore to sit by the fire with Robert. She tossed them into the snow with a laugh, like she was discarding trash. Next came a box of my books, then the decorative pillows I had hand-sewn. Mike joined her, carrying my small jewelry box and the framed photo of Robert and me from our wedding day. He didn't even look where he was throwing it, he just hurled it off the porch. It landed face down in a snowbank. "That's enough," I said, my voice shaking with fury. "Sheriff, please. I can't watch them destroy everything." Sheriff Miller nodded, his jaw set in a grim line. "Let's roll." He flipped on the lights. No siren, just the blinding blue and red strobes cutting through the morning gloom, and eased the cruiser out of the trees. We drove up the driveway slowly, the crunch of our tires on the gravel masked by the thumping music coming from the house. As we pulled up behind their blocked-in cars, the scene was one of grotesque indulgence. Several of the friends were on the porch, smoking and filming each other. Chloe was center stage, holding her phone up high on a selfie stick, live streaming to her followers. I could hear her shrill voice over the music. "Happy Thanksgiving, guys! Check out the new family estate. Lake views, fresh powder, and we are finally getting rid of the bad energy in here. Swipe up for the house tour." She spun around, capturing the pile of my belongings in the snow, treating my life like a prop for her vanity. She didn't notice the police car until the sheriff slammed his door shut. The heavy thud cut through the noise. Chloe froze. The phone still held aloft, her mouth hanging open in a perfect O of surprise. One by one, the friends on the porch noticed the uniform and the lights. The music abruptly cut off inside, plunging the mountainside into a sudden, ringing silence. I stepped out of the back seat, Jenkins flanking me on the left and the sheriff on the right. I buttoned my coat against the chill, lifting my chin. Mike appeared in the doorway, a glass of champagne in one hand, his face flushed with alcohol and indignation. He looked at the police car, then at me, and his expression twisted into a sneer. He didn't look afraid. He looked annoyed, like a manager dealing with a customer complaint. He stomped down the porch steps, crushing one of my sweaters into the mud with his boot as he walked. "What is this?" Mike shouted, gesturing at the sheriff with his glass. "You brought the cops, Sarah. Really? Are you that desperate for attention?" He stopped a few feet away from us, looming over me, ignoring the sheriff entirely. "This is a private family gathering. You are trespassing on my property. I told you to be gone by today." He turned to the sheriff, putting on a fake, chummy smile. "Officer, I'm glad you're here, actually. This woman," he pointed a finger in my face, "is refusing to vacate my father's house. I am the executor of the estate. Well, I will be once the paperwork clears next week. She's a squatter. I want her removed." "Is that so?" Sheriff Miller said, his voice calm and deep, resting his hand on his belt. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you broke down a door to get in here. We saw the whole thing from the road." "I broke into my own house," Mike yelled, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "I lost my keys. That's not a crime. My father, Robert Miller, owned this house. He died 3 weeks ago. I am his son. This," he waved his hand encompassing the cabin, the lake, and the sky, "is mine. By blood, by law." And he, glared at me with pure venom, "is just the gold digger he married. She has no rights here. Check the deed if you don't believe me. It's in Robert Miller's name." Chloe had lowered her phone but hadn't stopped recording. She stood behind Mike, chiming in, "Yeah, we checked the public records. Her name isn't on anything. You can't kick us out of our dad's house on Thanksgiving." The friends on the porch began to murmur in agreement, emboldened by Mike's confidence. They looked at me with disdain, the intruders judging the owner. I looked at Mike. Really looked at him. I saw the fear behind the bluster, the desperate need for money masking itself as entitlement. I took a slow breath, the cold air filling my lungs, steadying me. "You're right about one thing, Mike," I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the tension. "Robert did own this house, and he knew exactly who you were. He knew this day would come." I turned to Jenkins and nodded. "Show them." Jenkins stepped forward, placing his briefcase on the hood of the sheriff's car. The click of the latches opening sounded like gunshots in the quiet air. He pulled out the thick binder with the red seal. "Mr. Miller," Jenkins said, his tone professional and dry, "you are operating under a significant misunderstanding regarding the ownership of this property." Mike laughed, a nervous barking sound. "I don't need to see your fake papers, old man. I know the law." "You know some of the law," Jenkins corrected him. "But you missed the most important part." He held up the document, the title page fluttering slightly in the wind. "This is the Robert Miller Living Trust." The words "Living Trust" hung in the cold mountain air like a sentence, heavy and final, instantly sucking the oxygen out of Mike's arrogant tirade. He blinked, the glass of champagne in his hand tilting dangerously as his brain tried to process a legal concept that contradicted his entire financial strategy. Trust. He spat the word out like it was poison. "What are you talking about?" Dad didn't have a trust. He hated lawyers. He told me 1,000 times he wanted to keep things simple. Mike looked back at Chloe for support, but she had lowered her phone. The live stream ended, a flicker of genuine panic beginning to crack her carefully sculpted makeup. "He's lying, Mike," she shrilled, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's a trick. They just typed that up to scare us. Mom said Dad never signed anything formal." "Your mother hasn't been part of Robert's financial life for 20 years, Jenkins said calmly, opening the binder on the hood of the patrol car. The wind ruffled the heavy cream-colored pages, but Jenkins' hand was steady as he smoothed them down. "And Robert didn't hate lawyers, Mike. He hated conflict. He hated the idea of his life's work being torn apart in a probate court battle, or worse, liquidated for quick cash to fund a lifestyle he didn't approve of." Jenkins tapped a paragraph on the third page. "Date of execution, August 14th, 3 years ago. Notarized, filed, and fully funded. The title to this property, 442 Lakeview Drive, was transferred from Robert Miller, individual, to the Robert Miller Living Trust on that same day. You missed it in your public records search because you were looking for what you wanted to find, not what was actually there. You saw Miller on the grantor index and stopped reading. Amateur mistake. Mike stepped forward, snatching the binder before the sheriff could stop him. He scanned the pages frantically, his eyes darting back and forth, desperate to find a loophole, a missing signature, anything. But the document was ironclad. I watched the color drain from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly gray that clashed with his expensive designer scarf. This says. He stammered, his finger trembling on the paper. Sole trustee, Sarah Miller. Life estate. Sarah Miller. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with betrayal. He gave it to you. Everything. He cut his own children out for you. He didn't cut you out of his love, Mike, I said softly, stepping closer to the hood of the car. But he knew you. He knew both of you better than you know yourselves. I looked past him to Chloe, who was now gnawing on her fingernail. Robert spent his whole life building security. He worked 7 days a week to buy this place. He told me the night he signed these papers that his biggest fear wasn't dying. It was that you two would treat his legacy like a lottery ticket. He knew that if he left this house to you directly, it would be sold within a month to buy cars or cover gambling debts. He wanted this house to stay in the family, to be a place of rest, not a line item on a balance sheet. So we get nothing. Chloe screamed, her voice cracking. She rushed forward, grabbing Mike's arm. Mike, the crypto buy-in is tomorrow. We leveraged the down payment based on this sale. If we don't have the deed, we default. We'll lose the apartment in the city. Her confession hung in the air, exposing the true depth of their desperation. They weren't just greedy. They were broke, gambling with money they didn't have, banking on a dead man's asset to bail them out. Jenkins cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to the binder. You don't get the house, he corrected. The trust stipulates that Sarah has the right to live here, manage the property, and control access for the remainder of her natural life. Upon her passing, the asset will be donated to the State Park Conservancy. Robert ensured it would never be sold. Ever. He paused, letting that sink in. However, there is a small cash inheritance for both of you in a separate account. But Jenkins pointed to a clause at the bottom of page 10, bolded in black ink. This is the no contest clause. It states that if any beneficiary attempts to challenge the validity of this trust, harass the trustee, or interfere with the management of the estate, they automatically forfeit their cash distribution. It goes to charity instead. Jenkins looked up over his spectacles. I'd say breaking down the door and throwing the trustee's clothes in the snow constitutes harassment, wouldn't you? The silence that followed was absolute. The friends on the porch, realizing the party was definitively over and that they were witnessing a family implosion, began to awkwardly shuffle backwards. One by one, they slipped back into the house to grab their bags, keeping their heads down, avoiding eye contact with Mike. The DJ music inside had been cut, leaving only the sound of the wind in the pines. Mike looked at the document, then at me, then at the sheriff. The bluster was gone, replaced by the terrified realization of a man who had just played his final card and lost everything. This isn't fair, Mike whispered, the fight draining out of him. It's my dad's house. It was his house, Sheriff Miller interjected, his voice hardening as he stepped forward, hand resting near his handcuffs. And he decided who gets to be in it. Right now, that person is Sarah, which brings us to the immediate problem. The sheriff gestured to the splintered doorframe and the mess on the lawn. You folks are currently trespassing, breaking and entering, destruction of private property. I've got enough here to arrest every single one of you and impound those fancy cars as evidence. Chloe let out a sob, clutching her designer handbag. Please, no. I can't be arrested. I have brand deals. A mugshot would ruin me. Then I suggest you listen very carefully to the lady of the house, Sheriff Miller said, nodding towards me. I looked at them. My stepchildren, who had bullied me, threatened me, and tried to erase me. I could have told the sheriff to cuff them. I could have sued them for the damages. But looking at their pathetic, shivering forms, I didn't feel the need for vengeance. I just wanted my peace back. I wanted my home back. I won't press charges, I said, my voice steady. Mike looked up, hope flashing in his eyes. On 2 conditions. I pointed a gloved finger at the snowy yard. First, you are going to pick up every single thing you threw out. Every sweater, every book, every shard of glass from the photo frame you broke. You are going to carry it back inside and place it gently on the table. If one thing is left in the snow, the deal is off. Mike stared at the muddy, wet clothes scattered across the pristine white snow. You want us to pick up trash. It's not trash, Mike, I said sharply. It's my life. And yes, you, not your friends. You and Chloe. I turned my gaze to the girl. And second, once you are done, you will delete that live stream, delete the photos, and you will get in your cars and never come back here unless invited. Which, given today's performance, won't be anytime soon. And if we don't, Mike challenged weakly, a last gasp of defiance. Then I invoke the no contest clause immediately, Jenkins said pleasantly, and the sheriff takes you to the county jail for the holiday weekend. Judges around here don't look kindly on people who break into widows' homes on Thanksgiving. The choice was no choice at all. For the next 20 minutes, under the watchful eye of the sheriff and the silent judgment of their retreating friends, Mike and Chloe Miller performed the most humbling task of their lives. I watched from the warmth of the sheriff's car as they trudged through the knee-deep snow in their Italian leather boots. Mike, who had talked about millions in crypto, was now on his knees, digging my wet wool sweaters out of a drift, shaking off the ice. Chloe, shivering in her thin coat, had to gather the scattered pages of a book she had tossed, her mascara running down her cheeks. It was a pathetic, visceral dismantling of their ego. They brought the items to the porch, piling them neatly as I had instructed. They didn't look at me. They couldn't. The shame was a physical weight on their shoulders, heavier than any box they carried. When the yard was finally clear, Mike walked up to the car window. He looked wet, cold, and utterly defeated. "We're done," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. "We're leaving." "Good," I said, rolling down the window just an inch. "Drive carefully. The roads are icy." He hesitated, as if he wanted to say something. An apology, perhaps. Or maybe just a curse. But the words died in his throat. He turned around, signaled for Chloe, and they walked back to their cars. The engine of the Range Rover roared to life, but it lacked the aggressive punch it had earlier. Now, it just sounded like an escape vehicle. I watched as the convoy of luxury SUVs reversed out of the driveway, tires spinning helplessly for a moment in the slush before finding traction. They slunk down the mountain road, taillights fading into the gray afternoon, leaving the cabin bruised, but still standing. Well, Sheriff Miller exhaled, watching them go. That's one way to spend a holiday. "Thank you, Sheriff." "Thank you, Jenkins," I said, opening the car door and stepping out onto the gravel. The air was crisp and clean, the smell of cheap cologne and exhaust fumes dissipating with the wind. "I think I'm ready to go inside now." "We'll wait until you're secured," Jenkins said, gathering his binder. "I'll call a locksmith to come out first thing tomorrow to fix that jam. For tonight, the deadbolt should hold." I walked up the steps to the porch, past the pile of wet clothes that Mike and Chloe had retrieved. I picked up the photo frame Mike had thrown. The glass was shattered, a spider web of cracks obscuring Robert's face, but the picture underneath was unharmed. I brushed a snowflake off the frame and pushed open the broken door. The house was silent. The obnoxious music was gone. The intruders were gone. I stepped across the threshold, reclaiming the space, the warmth of the old wood welcoming me back like an old friend who had been holding its breath, waiting for the rightful owner to return. As the taillights of Sheriff Miller's cruiser disappeared around the bend of the mountain road, following the retreat of Jenkins' sedan, a profound silence descended upon the property. It was sudden and heavy, rushing in to fill the vacuum left by the chaotic noise of engines, shouting, and thumping bass. I stood on the porch for a long moment, clutching my coat tighter around myself, listening to the wind whisper through the pines. The snow in the yard was trampled, marked by the erratic footprints of Mike and Chloe, scars of their intrusion. But fresh flakes were already beginning to fall, soft and white, promising to cover the ugliness by morning. The battle was over. The invaders had been repelled, not by force, but by the quiet, invincible shield of paper and foresight. I took a deep breath, inhaling the sharp, clean scent of pine and coming snow, purging the lingering smell of Mike's expensive cologne and the exhaust fumes of their luxury cars from my lungs. I turned back to the house. The front door jamb was splintered, a jagged wound in the wood that pained me to see, but I managed to wedge the door shut and secure the deadbolt. It would hold for tonight. Stepping back into the living room, the silence inside felt different now. Before they arrived, the house had felt empty, a vessel of grief. Now, it felt like a survivor. The floor was wet with melted snow from their boots, and the air still held a faint, stale odor of the champagne they had sprayed in their premature celebration. I couldn't sit down. Not yet. I needed to reclaim the space. I spent the next hour moving methodically through the room, wiping up the puddles, straightening the rugs, and returning the furniture to its rightful place. I picked up the stack of wet sweaters that Mike had piled on the table, draping them near the hearth to dry. Every motion was a ritual, a way of erasing their presence and telling the house that it was safe again, that it was still ours. When the last trace of mud was wiped away, I knelt before the great stone fireplace. The fire had died down to gray ash during the confrontation, a cold hearth for a cold afternoon. I crumpled up a piece of old newspaper, ironically, a section of the financial page, and arranged kindling over it. The match flared, and within minutes, the dry birch logs caught, snapping and popping with a comforting familiarity. The orange glow spread across the room, chasing away the shadows and the chill, reflecting in the dark glass of the windows like a beacon. I poured myself a single glass of the red wine Robert had loved, a Cabernet Sauvignon we had been saving for a special occasion. I suppose surviving an attempted coup by one's stepchildren on Thanksgiving was occasion enough. I sank into Robert's old leather armchair, the leather groaning softly under my weight. It was the seat he always claimed, the one positioned perfectly to look out over the deck and onto the expanse of Lake Tahoe. I rested my head back, closing my eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the fire seep into my bones. The exhaustion hit me then, a physical wave that left my hands trembling slightly against the stem of the wine glass. It wasn't just the stress of today, it was the release of weeks of tension, the uncoiling of the fear that I would lose the only piece of him I had left. "You knew," I whispered into the quiet room, opening my eyes to look at the urn on the mantelpiece. "You old fox. You knew exactly what they would do." I looked out the window. The lake was a sheet of gunmetal gray, vast and unyielding, framed by the white-capped mountains. It was a view Robert had worked his entire life to secure, not for the status, but for the peace. I thought about the living trust sitting safely in Jenkins' briefcase. I thought about the secrecy. Robert hadn't told me because he didn't want to burden me with the knowledge of his children's true nature while he was alive. Or perhaps he hoped he was wrong. But he had prepared for the worst-case scenario with the precision of a master architect. He hadn't just left me a house. He had left me a fortress. He had anticipated their greed, their timing, even their arguments, and he had disarmed them from beyond the grave. A tear slipped down my cheek, hot and fast. But it wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of overwhelming gratitude. Even in death, Robert was still protecting me. He was still standing between me and the world, his love translated into legal clauses and ironclad protections. I took a sip of the wine, the rich, oaky flavor filling my mouth, and raised the glass slightly towards the lake, towards the sky, towards him. "Happy Thanksgiving, Robert," I said softly, the fire crackling in agreement. I was alone in the big wooden cabin, with a broken door and a snowy yard, but I had never felt less lonely. The house wrapped around me, warm and solid, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt a profound, unshakable sense of peace. I was home, and I wasn't going anywhere.